Safe Harbor Conversations, engaging heart, mind, and soul. And now we continue our conversation about AI and God. And we're glad that you have taken some time. We thank you for spending a few minutes here to listen and watch. Our conversationalists today are Professor Stephen Lloyd-Moffett, Cal Poly Religious Studies. He is also a writer and a social commentator. Wink Farrand, life coach, pastor, and our social media shepherd. And I'm Tom Cochrun, a writer, journalist, analyst, and a Presbyterian elder. AI, by most measures, it is an historic moment in human history. There are marvelous expectations and there are dire concerns. Response to AI is accelerating, even as fast as AI and these neural networks are expanding. Since our last conversation, the EU has begun working on categorizations, regulations, including categorizations of threat levels. China has proposed rules and regulations even more restrictive than the EU, and China insists that all intellectual content produced by AI should be consistent with their national core values. A machine learning tool claims that it can now, with 99% accuracy, depict and catch a chat GPT essay. But there are also some creative advances. Robert Wong, who is the vice president of creative labs at Google, says that AI will liberate the human imagination and that we will begin to see new art forms created by the combined united efforts of both artificial intelligence and human intelligence being liberated. And doctors are now using chatbots to have conversations with their patients, and according to some, they are more emphatic. So it is an important time in our history. And Stephen, we are very glad that you are able to join this conversation with us. As somebody who pays attention to these sorts of things of deep human value, what do you think is at play here? What are the implications for the larger world and more specifically for faith communities?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tom, for having me on, and Wink for joining us and being a part of this Safe Harbor Presbyterian Church discussion. I have to say that it has exploded in my world over the past year. I cannot tell you how many emails my philosophy department sends amongst each other just about what's happening with ChatGPT, its implication for education, its implication for the study of consciousness, the ethical implications of it. Now, philosophers love to talk about most things, but I have not seen in my tenure at Cal Poly a topic that has elicited more paragraphs from philosophers than the implications of AI the last 6 months. Now, I'm in religious studies, which is under the philosophy department, so I'm a part of the philosophers, but I'm not a philosopher by training at all. But it has impacted religion a lot too. And so much discussion among my religious studies colleagues just about the implications for religious groups, for ethics, and all across it. So I have not seen a topic that has so sort of disrupted the everyday conversation, because we're all trying to figure this out and trying to figure it out together, because it seems like technology is moving faster than our human reflection upon it.
Well, as the EU, as China, as the United States and other agencies around the world discuss how to use AI and should we put sort of levels of imposition of what they can and cannot do, don't you think also, I think you would, that it's absolutely important that theologians, philosophers, and ethicists be at that table and contribute?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Tom, because with so much of the new technologies, whether it's AI or robotics or digital heavens, or so much of this stuff, the technology people, the people within the industry, uh, don't usually have the training or the interest to consider the religious implications. I remember I did some work a few years ago with artificial intelligence and robots, and there was a robot developed in it went live in Saudi Arabia. It was a woman they called Sophia, and what was different about her, this was about
Mhm.
2018, what was different about her is she learned how to be human by interacting with others. And one of the things that was surprising to people is that she began to act religious. And I don't know why that's surprising to people, because if you learn how to be
Mm.
human by talking with other humans, and four-fifths of the world is religious, you're going to learn to be religious. And what it sort of made me realize is that so many of the scientists developing the technology just not to make generalizations, but many of them are not religious. And so they, don't exist in a world where they contemplate, the religious character of their neighbors as much. They live in a world where they want to make the technology work. And so it's a part of our reality that the people creating the goods, whether it is nanotechnology or artificial intelligence or robotics or all these sort of new technologies, they dwell in worlds that are highly secular, and yet they put the technology into worlds that are highly religious. And it's just important for us to talk with them and think through, like, the implications of unleashing a technology into a world where religion is important to people.
Mm.
Wink, you spend a lot of time in technology and have begun to see probably some affect of chat use and artificial intelligence in how those of you who shape messages are shaping the messages, and your thoughts, your concerns.
I do, and you're right. I use it a lot. I will use, and I'll go to one of the three main ones, even though there's over 100 different of them that you can use to interface with a chat type environment. I'll use them to make posts. It's probably one of the easiest thing to ask a chat bot to write a 1 minute Instagram video post with a hook. And then I'll take maybe 500-600 words and ask it to transform that into this 1 minute video post, making suggestions as to video clips and whatnot. And sometimes it does a fairly good job. Uh, other times it doesn't do good at all. There were a couple of posts I made this week where I just had to do it. It just did not even begin to come close. And I think my main concern is we're still at a point where it does the programming learns, but it mimics more than it creates. So it's one of those things where, uh, for example, you take generated voice, and you can pay so much a month to have, and if you don't want to do the announcing, you can pay so much to have this robot voice, which kind of sounds very human, read your script. But then you have to punctuate it the way you want it to read. So if you have a greeting like hello, and you put an exclamation mark at the end of hello, it will say hello. Whereas if you have the word stop and you put an exclamation mark, it will say stop. And it will say it exactly the same as it said hello. But that's not the way we communicate. A greeting is much different than telling somebody, stop, don't do that. There is this intentional inflection in our voices that a computer doesn't, unless you give a whole line of or whole paragraph of instructions as to how to pronounce this. We do it automatically, and it is more mimicry than it is actually creative.
You know,
But
I
oh,
think there are
go ahead.
maybe producers and directors all over the world right now who are saying, "Now, get me that kind of talent." So
Yeah,
you will
right.
do it exactly the way I want it done. Uh, I want to harken back. You were talking about they learn from us and they learn about human behavior. Um, do we treat artificial intelligence in our interactions with them when Wink is giving a command and listening for the response? Is it right? Is it good? Maybe he should put more punctuation in, or you're communicating via your computer with a chat bot. Do we treat them as a human being? Do we treat them with the kind of respect that we would expect to be treated by because they are aping and learning human behavior? Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think actually Wing's point is the essential thing that I've learned over the last 3 months is that all this chat GPT and artificial intelligence, they don't think, they don't know anything, they don't write. What they do is
Hmm.
mimic. And they
Hmm.
mimic, and sometimes better, sometimes worse, but all they are mimicking. And thus, when they're the degree to which they are good or bad or nice or not nice is dependent upon what they're mimicking. And so as we've seen all these experiments where after months they start getting mean or they start talking back, but they're not thinking, they're not getting mean, they're learning, they're reflecting humanity. And in that sense, it's a
Hmm.
really interesting sort of experiment in self-reflection as a community. Because the fact that AI can get mean or get jealous, they're not getting jealous. They're not getting mean. They don't think. They don't exist. All they are mimicking. And so what they're doing is revealing what they reveal, what they're finding online. And this is also an issue because we've learned so much that what people do online is very different than what we do face to face. I mean, even doesn't matter how much you disagree with your neighbor, three-quarters of the things that are in the comment lines you would just never say to your neighbor
Hmm.
outright. I mean, people are just so much more mean, so much more curt, so much more attacking, and part of it is it's 2 a.m. and they're sitting in their bed, half drunk or whatever. And, it's like throwing out things that don't really matter. And we realize human to human, we don't have that. And so oftentimes what ChatGPT is mimicking is kind of the worst side of human behavior. Now,
Hmm.
to your question, Tom, should we be nice to it so they begin to mimic that? I don't know. I think there's so much overwhelming data on the other side, but it is an interesting question. I remember I lost my mom a couple of years ago. Almost 3 years ago now, and my dad, lived alone for the first time in 55 years, and he moved into an apartment and upstairs there's a loft, so we don't kind of have a guest bedroom, we have a loft. And so you can hear what goes on in the rest of the apartment. And I love it because he gets up early and says, Alexa, tell me the news. Alexa, what's the weather? But he always says, thank you, Alexa. Oh, sorry, Alexa is just telling me the news over there. But my dad says thank you, and said, would you please tell me these things? And part of me is like, Dad, you don't need to do that. She's going to give you the news whether you say please or not. But part of me, as you say, Thomas, maybe Alexa's learning. This is how humans should react to one another. So
Hmm.
I feel mixed on it.
I
Well,
have a question for Steve, real quick. Uh, your focus is religion, you were saying. Um, are you aware that there have been now several trials with doing mass with an AI generated bot, something similar to Synthesia, where the entire mass is written out and uh, have you seen that on the news? And now there are Instagram reels with a face that gives a 1 minute devotional.
Yeah.
But it is AI generated. What are
Yeah,
your
there
thoughts on that?
yeah, there's a whole growth. I just saw it just this morning, and there's an article in Washington Post on pulpit GPT, which they're like, oh,
Right.
we're not writing sermons, but what we will do is take your sermons and give you a week's worth of social media strategy. So we'll break it down into, here's a Twitter post for each day, here's a Instagram post, or or whatever. And so there's a big growth area on this. And as you were saying earlier, Wink, I think is so important is when it's mimicking, the creators can choose what to mimic. And there's a great human role in that. And I'm told they're called annotators, and these are masses. I think I read 1 million people around the world are working as annotators right now because it's such a growth area, and they're sort of telling the Chat GPT what they're seeing, what they're acting. And so there is a sort of predisposition that you're giving to each of these Chat GPT or artificial intelligence groups. So one of them is Chat KGV, Chat King James Version, which is trying to give it a bias through the lens of the King James Version. So it will make observations on society based almost solely on the King James Version, which must sound very strange when you audioize it. Thou art going out the door now. But in any case, you have that, and then the Catholic Church has developing an AI bot to feed Catholics on advice on how to live, and it's being populated by the Catechism, by the sermons of past popes, by official decrees, and so they're sort of creating a lens through which to populate these things. And so, yeah, it's being used as a tool, and I guess I'm fine with that. I mean, there's always been study Bibles that help us, interpret the Bible. One of the things I'm mixed. We can talk about the effect upon students, but at some point, I don't have any issue with my pastor using, spell check on their sermon or Grammarly or a study Bible. And so we're really just talking about what kind of aids are appropriate and whether you can trust them or not. The reality is artificial intelligence can't be heretical and they can't be orthodox because they're not anything. All they are mimicking sources. And so you can get good things and bad things. And let me just give you one example. I was criticized. I was teaching class on Christianity, and I have a section on mysticism. And I do a lot on Orthodox mystics. I do a lot on Catholic mystics. And then apparently I did a throwaway line, Protestant mystics aren't very interesting or something like that. Now, my training's mostly in the early church, and so it partly reflects my training. But I decided, well, I should add a section on Protestant mystics. And we had just been out to dinner the night before with a friend who's very into artificial intelligence, an ex-technology guy. And he had me put in my essay prompts into ChatGPT to see if they could answer it, and they could very well. I mean, it wasn't horrible, but it couldn't very well. But anyhow, so I had the window open, and so I said, "Hey, give me the top 10 Protestant mystics to ChatGPT." And I said, well, maybe this is a good place to start. I mean, this is maybe a place where I'm deficient. 7 of the 10 it listed were Catholic, not Protestant. But of course, ChatGPT doesn't know Catholic from Protestant. It's just mimicking. But what was so strange about it to me was they gave one sentence sort of intros into each one of these mystics. And in the one sentence intro, it said the famous Catholic mystic, so-and-so, is a great Protestant mystic. And I was like, well, if a freshman in high school wrote that sentence, it wouldn't pass. And so in some ways, it's just incredible what it can do. And then in some ways, it's just astonishing about how just basically wrong it is on so many things.
That's a hallucination, right? When it does that, I think.
Well, no,
I think
so
it started
Yeah, so I think it's slightly different from hallucination. So a hallucination is when it makes up something from scratch.
Oh,
Here it's just where it makes a false connection, right? Because both it is true that this was a truly Catholic mystic. They'll say Meister Eckhart or something like that. They're just making a false connection. The hallucination is really interesting because this same after this same conversation I said, well, I should check this thing out and whatever. So I just wrote in, well, what do I know about myself? Who is Stephen Lloyd-Moffett and what are his contributions to the field of religious studies? And it gave me this page and a half where there was not a sentence right. It said I was born in North Carolina in 1924. I was a scholar of Buddhism and sex. It even gave me books that I had written apparently, and they were great sounding books. One was like Buddhism and sexual enlightenment, and I was like, well, that probably would sell pretty well as a book. I mean, but it even and I checked, these aren't even books. They made up book titles. They made up years they were published. They made up quotes from particular pages on the book titles. And then if you've been on ChatGPT, you can regenerate. So I did it 5 times. It made up completely different things in each time. And only one sentence out of 5 biographies was right. And all that one sentence said is Steve Lloyd-Moffett is a professor at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. But
Stephen, I
that's
want to ask you.
hallucination.
I want to ask you, as a theologian, ethicist, philosopher, is at a table and they have a similar kind of experience, and they're talking about regulations and maybe how things should be used. How would you counter that? I mean, how would you explain that this thing that only mimics and cannot think is able to create this expansive sort of non-existence and pass it off as reality? I mean,
Yeah.
A, what does that mean? How does it happen? And then B, if you're at the table with people that are really talking about how to put some kind of rules on this, how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
Where do you
And
start?
so part of the issue that I always have with it is it's so confident whether it's completely wrong or completely right. I mean, it doesn't say like, or the boundary I would put in is to ask them to be like, how confident you are. Like maybe there's a metric saying like, oh, this is based on 10,000 sources. Because the reality is we're also asking Chat GPT to create fiction, right? And so if people are like, tell a short story about a bunny rabbit and an apple tree, we want ChatGPT or we want some sort of AI to be able to do that. So it's okay that it creates fiction. It just needs to designate when it is fiction and when it's based on facts. And so I think there should be some sort of metric saying this is based on X number of sources, or we have a 50-degree confidence in this, or some element where you can say, because the same friend who's very into AI, he says it's a great tool if you already know the answer. In other words, if you know the answer and you're just wanting some tips on how to put it together, some strategies for constructing the paragraph or the intro or whatever, that's fine. If you don't know the answer, don't trust it. And that's kind of I think that's a decent starting point.
Well, given where we are as a Western society, particularly in terms of our knowledge of history and even our intellectual performance, and at the same time our growing dependence upon these technologies of convenience, where are the roads leading? Where do they intersect, and sort of what are the implications?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people are been making a lot of analogies, but one is to the printing press, and how disruptive that was. And of course, there are people who are like, "Oh, this is a demonic force that needs to be expelled from, faith communities." There's others who embraced it. And what do we learn from the printing press? Well, there can be a lot of wonderful books created, and there could be a lot of crap out there. And it's up to the human person to decide whether they want to read the edifying output of the printing press or the unedifying output of the printing press. And I think that's sort of the same framework here, is that, we have to train people to be able to use technology in ways that are helpful, as opposed to harmful, to click on the things that are edifying and uplifting as opposed to the things that are divisive and contrary. Because, I mean, in the end, as with most technologies, it's going to be up to humans to decide how to use them. Now, we could say this is entering a new territory because there will be automated decisions made. A lot of my colleagues are doing a lot of ethics on AI and warfare, because, boy, that's a huge hornet's nest to be making decisions. And certainly there are massive implications for all that. And it's the philosopher's dream. Every philosophy professor sort of lives for their variation of the trolley car ethical issue. And basically we have 100 million trolley car thought experiments going on with AI right now. So there's certain important things to put around the guardrails. But I think for most of us in day to day, it's going to be one of those things that's up to us to decide: can we use it in edifying ways, or do we use it in destructive ways?
At the same time, I'm not for battening down any of the potential applications. I think we have to have a very sound understanding of the implications of that research. Had I gone to an AI, the one that you went to ask for your bio, to prepare a bio for this, how am I to know you have not written that book and that you are not this person born in 1924? I mean, again,
Exactly.
relying upon tools of convenience has become, I think, one of those dependencies that we all live with now. And it is very simple, rather than to do the old-fashioned research that we used to do, now maybe to go to Bard and ask some questions and maybe try to get a diagnosis or some understanding of a diagnosis that has been handed to us. There needs to be some way for us at the user's end, because these systems are already out there. We're sort of chasing the horse now that it's out of the barn. How do we know that you're not born in 1924?
Right. And something else, I was reading an article written by a particular lawyer that was contributing to a column for one of the news organs. I can't remember which one it was. But he said in his own editorial staff that they had a lot of raised eyebrows because AI had actually written and published on a lesser known journal a story about him involved in a crime.
Yeah.
It made up the crime, made up the court case that he appeared in, and, it caused a little bit of consternation for a couple days until they fact checked and found it was all mythology. Is just all fictional. So, AI is one of those things where I think we're going to have to constantly be fact checking and saying, well, is this really true? And not just have it as a source that we can truly believe is actually what it is that it's saying. I think we're always going to have to come back to the fact that we need to double check this thing for a while.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I think with that, Wink, it's interesting because I think there's a sort of mythology that AI is becoming like a god. Like when we think about gods, gods are all knowing, all powerful, and the sort of mythology around this AI is, well, it is processing through billions of pieces of data, and it will have perfect knowledge. And the reality is, no. What it's doing is it's mimicking, based on pattern recognition in millions of pieces of knowledge, not millions of pieces of data, and not all those pieces of data are accurate. And so even if we could stop it hallucinating, to be like, if I don't know, I will just say don't know, as a mimicry device, it's going to mimic the quality of the sources. And so, we need to change how we see it. Now, one thing that's, sort of fascinating if you think about education is for, sort of your sixth, seventh grader, they're writing papers, oh, what is the Soviet Union? And they go to Wikipedia, and that's their source, right? In my era, it
Right.
was Encyclopedia Britannica, but now they go to Wikipedia, right? Then as they go to high school, they will look up several different sources, and they kind of learn which sources are good and which sources are bad. When they go to college, one of their first weeks is let's go explore the library. Now it's almost virtual. Let's go explore the library virtually and sources. And now they begin to use popular histories. By the time you get to grad school, you're really deep down into professional journals, that are more difficult to read. But basically, what education is learning to digest more complex sources and then integrating those into a new worldview that you present. I mean, that's kind of a basic of education. Well, the kind of training we need to give students now is not just how to use the library, but how to actually use the output of ChatGPT or the output of Google search. How do you use those things to convey a accurate view of the world, or at least a more nuanced view of the world, and that becomes a whole new skill that some of the older professors maybe just want to retire before you start having to teach that, but the young professors get it, like that this is the skill of the next 20 years, learning how to discern. And part of the issue I have, and I've written elsewhere about this, with just the lack of trust in experts, is if you don't have expertise, and anybody's podcast is equal to the best journal from Oxford, well, we're living in a world where everybody's just finding the facts to fit their narrative. And so we
Right.
need to
Right.
reestablish the value of expertise, the value of methodology, the value of actually taking a genuine look at that. And those of us who sort of make our career on expertise need to remind people why that there's a reason we spent 8 years in a PhD program, and that maybe my opinion on this religion is better than the knitter across the street who has a podcast and got interested in something one day.
Stephen,
Mhm.
how would you rate the job that we're doing in education in terms of teaching coming generations how to utilize all media, how to discern, how to make critical evaluations and judgments about what it is that they are consuming, and actually trying to authenticate sources and certify validity? Are we doing that in public schools? Are we doing it well? Do we need to do more of it?
Yeah, my sense is we're not particularly doing it well. I think there's a lot of consternation among those over here going, boy, is this something we should do? But the reality is most of us were trained in environments where we went to the library and found the book with the most dust and pulled it out and gleaned page 124 for this great quote, and that's what we get rewarded for. So it's hard to be like, hey, you know just something real basic, you need to do it. I use this example when I teach Islam. I said the reality is most people, when they look to Islam, just Google stuff. And I just did, I do in class, I do Islam and Sharia. And Sharia is one of the most misunderstood sort of elements of religion in the world. And so there's a lot of bad information out there. But of the top five Google sites that come up when you put Islam and Sharia, three are anti-Islamic sites, like sites that, now one says this, it's called like answeringislam.com or something like that. But one's called religionofpeace.com, which, sounds fair, sounds useful, right? But it's actually an anti-Islam site. And then of the fourth one is Wikipedia, which I always say Wikipedia is not bad for like dates or like, facts that you can't think. It's just really bad at everything else. But if you want to know the content of the Nicene Creed, like it will give you the Greek of the Nicene Creed, usually fine. Um, and then the last one was a Islamic apologist site, which was pretty good. But I know that because I've gone through these. Students are all like, "Oh, well, I found 3 sites that came up in the first 5 that all said the same thing," and I'm saying, "Well, those aren't good sites." So I think there's the realization that this is an issue, but so little of our training is grounded on how to find the most basic of all information and know what to trust, that I'm trying to think, I think it's right. I'm not even sure where that should be taught or where that could be taught. Like literature, you read English books together. History, you read history books together. Contemporary media engagement. I'm not even sure what department that falls under.
Right. How let me ask this question. It's sourcing is very important. I've written 3 different theses and have tried to come up with really accurate sourcing. And usually, if it was going down the track of a particular discipline, I didn't Google, because a lot of times Google would give me a whole slurry of sites. But see, I was Googling back at the turn of the 2000s, so it wasn't like it is now. But you get this whole, cacophony of sites. And like you said, some of them are just garbage. They're just absolute garbage. But when we didn't have Google, we could actually go, some of my research was done as interviews of people. I'm going straight to the source that had this particular opinion that I want to include in my thesis. How do you teach your students to source reliably now? Since everybody's just jumping on Google or going to Wikipedia, because as you've said, Wikipedia is not all that reliable, because it's everybody it's like its own AI. Everybody just throws into it without a whole lot of editing.
Yeah, no. So in most of my classes, we do a section on sources, and I give them, a whole list of sources and say rank these, because sometimes you can't get the best ones. So that part of it is just practice on it. But also one of the things I've sort of learned is you kind of have to make a differentiation between what kind of knowledge you're looking for, right? So there's sort of facts-based stuff where you find a few sites that all kind of give the same date of the Ottoman invasion of Constantinople, whatever. Yeah, okay, that's probably fine. It's more analysis where I have a deeper issue, because our students need to be able to construct arguments, need to be able to discover where the fallacy is, and so much of education in the lower grades are about regurgitating this. And so students will, in fact, just this last quarter, I gave a final exam question where I gave them a Picasso quote about art. I said, art is the smile of humanity. And I said, okay, well, the monks and nuns we studied this quarter fill in, if art is the smile of humanity, I think was the quote, then what are the people we studied for humanity? And I put it on the review sheet, because I said, hey, look, I want you to think about this. And several students came back and said, I've scoured my notes and I can't find where you told me the answer here. And I said, look, there isn't an answer. I want you to think, to reply. And they're like, well, how am I supposed to know the answer then? And I said, well, put your pen down and think for a little bit. Stop, consider the world. And if I can get you to think, and one of the things I tell them is, look, the whole educational process is a bizarre social experiment, right? We take these students right now that are 18 to 22, mostly at Cal Poly, when they are the most resilient, the most in shape, the quickest on their feet. And we, for the most part, take them out of society for 4 years and say, go read a bunch of books, write a bunch of papers, do some experiments, blah, blah, blah. Why? Well, it's not because they're going to make a lot of difference when they're 22 when they come out. The reality is most of them are going to get entry-level jobs somewhere. But the hope is if we can train them to think when they are in a position of influence in society, they will be more conscientious, they'll be more thoughtful, they'll be more humane. And so we're training them for when they one day have influence. And for most career paths, that's 40s to 60. And so we need to prepare them to think for that world, to be able to ascertain, like, here's the data available to me, and how do I integrate that data into a worldview? And if we as educators need to think through what that world would be like to help them use the data in ways that hopefully benefit society as it goes forward. But it's a difficult path because we're having to think through, like, what's this world going to be like?
I want to ask you about this business of art. I sent each of you a clip, which Wink will put up on the screen. It is created by Anu Garg, and she is a rather ethical person. She studies the origin and derivation of words, but she was fascinated by this potential of using her own input and having artificial intelligence render something. That little image that I sent you, it looks an awful lot like a Van Gogh, and that probably did in fact borrow images from Van Gogh. There are other artists today, less well known, less well compensated, and less historic, who also probably have had their work sampled by some artificial intelligence. And now we enter a command to ask them to create something, and maybe just a little bit or a lot has been borrowed, or maybe all of it has been borrowed from an artist, and it's been reworked. What is the ethical issue here? I mean, how are your students going to resolve that when it gets to some degree of litigation, or when there's push comes to shove in the society? What is right about that? It's impossible to go back and compensate Van Gogh, but a living working artist like C.W. Mundy today, he could be compensated. How do they
Yeah,
work that
no, I
out?
mean, yeah, I think it's a fascinating question because on the one hand, we're all inspired by different things. Most of, of honest, so much of my lectures at Cal Poly are grounded on my greatest professors of college, a college and then graduate school, like where my Tibetan Buddhism lecture is cribbed almost 100% from my Tibetan Buddhism professor at UCSB. Now, is that something that I'm borrowing from? I mean, it is, but you're doing. To me, I think the critical sort of juncture there is whether you're profiting off it. If she's going to create art for her friends, and it's inspired by Van Gogh or some lesser, okay, fine. We do that all the time. We take music and we write music. We're inspired by Johnny Cash and Winona Ryder, or Winona, whatever her name is, the singer, Winona Judd.
Right.
And we don't owe them anything, right? But we're inspired by them. But if I'm just writing a song for my friends, that most of us don't have an issue for that. In music, we say, well, if you're actually stealing a particular part of the music, well, then you need to pay the author. And there's a bunch of gray areas there, and that's why there's all these lawsuits about whether
Mhm.
so and so borrowed this from Queen or whatever in it. But yeah, so I think if there's a monetary value in it, that's fine. I think that's one category. If you're just using it to inspire you to do something different, or like I'm not particularly artistic, but I love the idea of saying, well, could you turn this vision into art for me? Um, yeah, I think that's great. That's great. Now, if it's clearly borrowed from one, just like any source, you should source it, right? You should say, hey, this analysis came from Wink Farrand's great article in 2003. Even if I'm not quoting it directly, I should note it. And so I think it's fair to note if you can where it comes from. But I don't think going down the rabbit hole of sort of saying, oh, this art is 22% Van Gogh and 17%, so and so, and we need to distribute it out, unless there's a huge financial gain for it. I don't see the problem with that.
Sounds like a conundrum for a Paso Robles vintner.
Yeah,
Well, that's what you
Someone,
call
yeah.
copyright law.
yeah.
And that's a whole uh, occupation in itself. One of the things about that picture, as you look at it, it shows a real flaw that AI art has, which it can't do hands very well, it can't do eyes very well, it can't do mouths very well. And if you look at the individual that's depicted there, if you look at the hands and the eyes and the mouth, and it's almost horrific at times. I have I don't know if you're aware of Canva. Some of your students use Canva. It's a software package that has included now an AI generated art. And so if you can't find the picture you want to put the post together, or the slideshow together, you can put a string of words in there and it will try and generate the art. Landscapes, it does fine. Rocks, trees, occasional birds, but human beings, it can't do it. It just can't do it. They look awful.
And maybe
So,
wait, that's such a great metaphor that
yeah.
we could mimic AI can mimic so much of life, but it just can't ever be human. It just will
Right.
never quite get it right. It will get so much of the world around us right. It will get the mountains right. It will get the trees. It will get the objects in our room right. But the fact that it, despite all its power, can't accurately reflect a human, I think is shows both its strength and its limitation. The AI art tools, they're not drawing. They're mimicking other drawings. They're not thinking.
Mhm.
They're not they're not desiring. And that I think is the strongest argument for not giving them that much power. Because if, I can admit that humans make mistakes, but I would still rather have a human who that's mistake prone, making difficult ethical decisions, than some program or algorithm that is just mimicking without the thought of consequences, right? Without
Mm.
knowing what it's doing. And so, some people are like, well, will AI functionally become our gods? Will it functionally be the thing that we turn to for advice and support? And the reality is, no, these things don't think, they don't feel. Like AI can't have empathy. AI can't feel somebody else's pain. Now, it can mimic empathy. It can know that, hey, I see a tear in this eye. Here are the five things I should say. Like it can learn that, but it never will feel. It never will think. It will never experience pain. And thus we're dealing with something that just doesn't have the human capability. And the fact that it can't actually even create a face is, is telling. Now, it probably will. over time figure that stuff out. But I do think it's a good metaphor for both the limitations and the strengths of AI.
Is Have you done any research, Stephen, with AI search on mysticism, something that you study and teach? Uh, it would seem to me that that becomes even more of a challenge for a non-sentient intelligence, quote unquote intelligence. It's a challenge for the human mind, even the human mind that may be very devoted. Um, but how have you done any of that work to sort of plunge into that?
Yeah, not so much in mysticism, um, but it does raise an interesting question because um, I've been doing some work on neuroimaging and spiritual experience, and it's been driven by a couple of questions, but most particularly is a member of my family has been experiencing psychosis that manifests itself in spiritual ways, and I it's a psychosis, it's a disease, but I'm often kind of brought in to be able to be the expert in the family to say, hey, those angels or those demons you're seeing, those aren't real. But at the same time, I walk into class and teach Hildegard of Bingham, who at age 13 had conversations with angels and demons and all this sort of stuff. And so I was like, there must be some way to ascertain whether they're having genuine spiritual experiences or non-genuine. And in the last 30 years, we've had all this neuroimaging technology. And I was like, gosh, all we need to do is, take images of the brain during these, under psychosis and mysticism. Well, as it turns out, nobody in a genuine mystical experience wants to be strapped to a gurney, put into a machine, and told to stand still. Nothing kills the mystic buzz like modern medicine, and psychosis patients don't either. And so it's been an interesting journey because the one people who say they're having a mystical experience, who are willing to be strapped down, are people using psychedelics. And so I've sort of delved deeply into this world of neuroimaging and psychedelics. But why I bring this up is someone like Thomas Merton has argued that psychedelics genuinely think people under psychedelics generally think they're having a mystical experience, but it's an inauthentic one. It is mimicking the genuine mystical experience. They're not having a genuine mystical experience. Their brain is teasing them to think they are. Now, and so there's this whole series of sort of questions of like, what is real in an experience? If I think it's real, is that real? Is it genuine? Is it thoughtful? And so I can ask ChatGPT or any of these AI groups to say, okay, tell me about a mystical experience, and I have no belief that it had a mystical experience or there's a sentient being behind it, but they could reflect it. They could take the amalgamation of others. Well, at some point that's troubling because obviously I know they're not having a real experience because there's no sentient being to have a real experience. But if you look at so many people's religious experiences, there's a degree of mimicry. There's a degree of copying. Let me give you an example of that. When they study people who speak in tongues, so this is when you have sort of raw Holy Spirit experiences. One of the fascinating, glossolalia,
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating elements about that is the linguistic researchers have shown that people speak in tongues with accents. So Southern communities speaking in tongues speak in Southern accents, British speak in British accents. And the first person to speak in tongues in a group setting sets the sort of standard of everybody else is speaking in tongues. Now, you could explain it being, well, the Holy Spirit can do whatever the Holy Spirit wants if it wants to do it. So I'm not discounting that it's possible to just be raw Holy Spirits, but there is a sort of strong probability that what's happening is people want to belong into their group. They hear somebody speak in tongues in a particular way, and they mimic it. Now, you could either take that to be like, oh, look at how fake religion is, or how this desire to connect and belong leads to a sort of collective effervescence where they have a deep communal experience through speaking in tongues. And so I think with I'm not sure so much how to think about asking ChatGPT for what's a mystical experience like, because on the one hand I know it's mimicry, on the other hand I'm pretty forgiving of mimicry in a lot of environments. So and I mean, and let me just since we're getting towards the end, let me throw you one kind of really fun question that I ask my students on this. If you're an AI bot or AI robot and you're learning how to react, right? And you learn, how to treat people, and you learn, and it makes decisions based on past. Well, I ask my students, can that entity be saved? And almost everybody says no. Salvation cannot happen for that. An afterlife cannot. But if you sort of take the analogy that a child is given a initial programming, your genes, and then what does it do? Well, it observes the world, it gets training, it sort of grows its experiences through religious education, through observation, through others. Then eventually it makes decisions based on that past, and then God judges that entity based on its predisposed programming and its learned behavior. Is the spiritual robot doing anything different? I mean, yes, it is, because it doesn't think. But really, I mean, I don't know. Maybe,
It's a fascinating area, and we are all just starting to begin to live with this. And one of the things that Robert Wong said that struck me, he's the vice president of creative at Google Labs, is that this artificial intelligence will begin to interplay with human intellect. And so we will be stimulated by that which we have created. And so that is, again, are we what we mimic? And we could ask that on either side of this equation. Stephen, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. There are several areas that we could continue to pursue, and we would like to invite you back in the future to join us. What we are trying to do here is examine those places where those things that we live with culturally intersect with those things that we believe most intimately and most devoutly. And I have admired your work, and we certainly appreciate you sharing some of your time with us. I know you're about to go take some time off. Have a great summer break, and know that when we get back, either us or Wink's chatbot will be in touch with you, and we will invite you back as we have further conversations.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for exploring these topics. I mean, they're very important and stimulating, and I appreciate all the work you're doing, and the community in Cambria and the virtual world will benefit from it.
Stephen, thank you. Have a great summer break. Wink, thank you. And for those of you who are listening or watching, we also thank you for your attention. There is more to talk about, and we will get to that later on Safe Harbor Conversations. Thank you.